We could, if we wanted to, compensate low-income earners. We could compensate industries that are particularly energy intensive. If we were smart, and that's a big if, we could take this one-off windfall and use it to help transition away from the use of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So that in the future, whether it's households or industry, they would be using less fossil fuels, have lower energy bills, and would be less exposed to events like this.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to be discussing a proposed windfall profits tax on gas companies in Australia.
Australia is facing its biggest energy crisis in 50 years.
Prices are high globally because European countries are looking for non-Russian sources of gas due to the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine.
Buyers are turning to Australia as they hunt for supplies of coal, gas and wheat to replace cargoes from Russia and Ukraine.
Australian gas companies are taking in record profits as prices soar.
Australian manufacturers are paying prices never ever imaginable.
Businesses and unions both want the government to be tougher on Australian gas producers.
We've got multinational companies making extraordinary windfall profits, whilst Australian households and Australian manufacturers reliant upon energy are getting it in the neck.
Big gas companies have been ripping off customers, consumers, households and small businesses for far too long. They're making windfall profits. They're not paying enough tax.
I think the government ought to consider a windfall tax. A lot of the gains to Australian gas and coal exporters are a windfall.
Cost of living, as you all know, is skyrocketing in Australia, partly due to rising energy costs. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has helped drive gas prices very high, and gas companies are making huge profits from the war, while Australian households and businesses are left struggling with higher energy bills and trying to make ends meet. So how can the federal government respond to this gas price crisis? New Australia Institute research looks at exactly how profitable the war in Ukraine has been for gas companies and examines the idea of implementing a windfall profits tax to compensate Australian households and businesses unfairly impacted by spiralling energy costs. To explain this idea, I'm joined by Richard Dennis, Executive Director at the Australia Institute. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb.
So just to give us a quick bit of background, explain how the war in Ukraine helps drive up energy prices and gas in particular.
Just 100 years of geopolitics. But look, the short answer is that Russia is a big exporter of gas, and that the world price and the world market for gas and the world market for oil are quite interrelated, because in some countries gas and oil are used interchangeably. And of course, the reason that a lot of gas and oil are burned is to make energy, which means that the markets for coal and oil and gas are all interlinked. So Russia's, the three biggest exporters of fossil fuel in the world are Saudi Arabia, Russia, and little old Australia. We're up there. So because of what's happening with the war in Ukraine, there's been significant disruption to the supply of gas, including the literal destruction of pipelines. And that's had a big impact on the price of all energy commodities around the world. And Australia is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, the big bubbly ships.
Yep.
That's us. And
we're the largest.
We're the largest. We export more of that kind of gas, the liquefied natural gas, than anyone else in the world. We overtook Qatar a few years ago, and we're usually the second largest exporter of coal in the world. So if you think the Saudis are big in oil, we're big in gas, and we're enormous in coal.
Right. So then gas companies are dealing, basically they're able to charge much higher prices because of the war in Ukraine. What's that doing to their profits?
Through the roof. So, yeah, imagine you were an American or English, they're almost never Australian, gas company in Australia, and you've got a hole in the ground and you're sucking gas out of that hole in the ground. And you've been doing that for, a year or 10. And it costs money to build the wells. It costs money to run the wells. And then the price you get for it is pretty much determined by the world price. So if you're an Australian exporter of gas, your costs didn't change really in any significant way after the war started, but the price you get has gone through the roof. So we used to call it profiteering. Like when companies would jack up prices during a war to take advantage of shortage, it was called profiteering. Now we just call it profit. And the Australian oil industry, but mainly gas industry and coal industry, are all benefiting incredibly from this surge in world prices that had nothing to do with them. And it's not costing them significantly more to extract it here in Australia. And profit is just the difference between your revenue and your costs.
So, yeah, they're basically raking in huge additional profits, but it's not because they're extra productive or haven't changed anything about the way they do business.
No, they're not doing anything different. It's literally, so the term windfall comes from the idea that when it's windy, fruit falls from a tree, right? So you don't have to climb the tree, you don't have to pick it. It's a very old-fashioned term, but windfall literally comes from that. It's just food falling from the sky, lands in your lap. So the Australian gas industry in particular and coal industry in particular have had this enormous windfall. These enormously profitable companies, their profits are now driven by this fact that Russia did something terrible in Ukraine, disrupted the world supply of gas, and the profits have just fallen into their laps.
As prices rise at the pump, so do profits for oil and gas companies.
World oil prices are up over 30% since the start of the invasion.
While wholesale electricity prices have skyrocketed to almost $500 today, a 500% increase.
And what are we talking about when we talk about these windfall profits? Because the research that we've got coming out has looked into this. What do we know about how much they're raking in?
A good year. It's somewhere between 26 and $40 billion.
40 billion at the upper.
In unexpected profits. Now, keep in mind, these were profitable industries.
To begin with.
This is just a lazy 40 bill into your back. Look what I found under the couch here.
That they didn't even have to work for.
Well, literally, it's a windfall.
Yeah.
And that's why economists like windfall taxes. You hear so much about how taxes distort the economy or discourage people from doing things. But a windfall is a windfall. It fell in your lap. And a Nobel Prize winning economist once made the point that, well, half a windfall is still a windfall. He said that after he won the Nobel Prize, which is $1 million. It's a tidy windfall. And he'd promised years before that he'd always go halves with his wife. And he'd subsequently separated from his wife, and someone said, oh, you must be a bit sad because, you lost $500,000. And he said, half a windfall's a windfall.
Yeah.
So taxing windfalls makes perfect sense to economists. Joe Stiglitz, when he was out here in Australia earlier in the year, said, it was a no-brainer.
It makes sense at this particular juncture to impose a windfall profits tax. The increase in the price of energy has been redistributive. The energy companies have done very, very well. They've made bundles, and ordinary Australians are suffering. And since so much of the energy companies are foreign-owned, it's really transferring money out of Australia's pockets into that of foreigners.
And think about Australia, one of the world's largest exporters of fossil fuels. The world price of fossil fuels has just gone through the roof, and we're feeling poor.
Yeah.
I promise you the Saudis aren't feeling poor at the moment. The Qataris aren't feeling poor because they actually effectively tax their exports.
And is there anyone else apart from Saudi Arabia and Qatar who have looked at this situation in particular and acted with a windfall profits tax?
Everyone. Pretty much. Look, the Norwegians already have very high rates of tax, and also very high rates of public ownership. So because the Norwegians, they don't understand economics, because their state-owned company is the profitable company, then the dividends go straight back to the Norwegian people. Crazy. It's real hypothetical stuff. But even that well-known lefty, rabid, progressive Boris Johnson proposed a windfall profits tax in the UK. Couldn't promise what's going to happen in the UK at the moment, but even Boris Johnson said, well, how about we all share the love here?
Yeah.
And again, to be clear, this is a windfall driven by a war. And the owners of the gas companies in Australia are just pocketing it.
The oil and gas sector is making extraordinary profits, not as the result of recent changes to risk-taking or innovation or efficiency, but as the result of surging global commodity prices, driven in part by Russia's war. And for that reason, I am sympathetic to the argument to tax those profits fairly.
So, Richard, is this kind of the same or different to existing taxes like petroleum resources rent tax?
Oh, the old PRRT. Look, they overlap. I mean, a petroleum resource rent tax is designed to capture a sort of fair share of profits in Australia for petroleum. But it doesn't. It collects almost no money. And
so it's kind of broken.
It's completely broken. So to give you a sense of it, we export more liquefied natural gas, LNG, than Qatar. They're second biggest. Qatar collects 20 times more tax on their gas than we do.
Ooh.
So we export more than them. They collect 20 times more tax than us.
Ooh,
so
we're definitely doing something wrong.
Yeah. So the PRRT, not so much. But if it was a highly functioning resource rent tax, economists use the word rent to mean sort of super profits, extra profits, more profit than you'd need to actually operate your business. A highly functioning petroleum resource rent tax would be collecting some of this windfall. But for example, the UK has that form of tax and still went for a windfall tax on top. We've gone for neither. We've got an entirely ineffective PRRT.
And no windfall profits tax.
Proudly. Determinedly so. So fixing the PRRT would help.
Yep.
It's a kind of windfall profits tax, but no tax regime is really designed to say, what if there's a once-in-a-half-century war and a particular industry just makes a fortune?
Yeah.
And keep in mind, you and I are paying more for electricity. You and I are paying more for petrol. You and I are paying more for energy. Even so while Australia is an enormous exporter of energy, because the energy in Australia is owned by not just private companies, but foreign-owned companies, there's enormous profits being made, but we Australians, we're paying higher prices. So kind of we're worse off. The Ukrainians are a lot worse off. The world's worse off, but the handful of companies that are making these windfall profits in Australia, well, they're having a good war.
It's our gas. It belongs to Australians, and Australians are entitled to a fair and reasonable price for what belongs to them.
And the Labor government has already indicated it is unlikely to pursue the idea. It does have strong memories of the campaign it faced over the mining and carbon taxes when it was last in office, while the opposition, licking its wounds after a big election.
The big gas producers would definitely fight such a windfall or super profits tax on gas. They'd be saying that this would deter foreign investment
And so is the idea with a windfall profits tax that you could compensate the people who are, particularly in the low income end of things, paying these higher prices that they can't afford? Is that part of the idea of this?
Look, well, it's a good idea, full stop.
Yeah.
Like there's just no reason to let the private companies that are having money shoveled into their pockets keep it all. All right. So it's just a good idea. Then it gets better when you start thinking, well, what are the good ideas we could then use that revenue for? We could, if we wanted to, compensate low-income earners. We could compensate industries that are particularly energy intensive. If we were smart, and that's a big if, we could take this one-off windfall and use it to help transition away from the use of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So that in the future, whether it's households or industry, they would be using less fossil fuels, have lower energy bills, and would be less exposed to events like this.
Is that what we're going to do, though?
No, because we're not collecting it.
Yeah.
And then we're saying we're too broke to do all these things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, again, it's no accident that Joe Stiglitz said this is a no-brainer. Let me just say, perhaps we don't have a brain.
And as part of this research, the Australia Institute did some polling around whether or not people think this is a good idea. What did that show?
Overwhelmingly popular. And of course, why wouldn't it be? Like, people understand what a windfall is. They understand that, Australian companies didn't cause their profits to rise through innovation, through taking more risk.
They're not working twice as hard.
They're not working twice as hard. They're just making a lot more money. And, often in Australia, people say, oh, everything's all about politics and people are poll-driven. I like democracy. Sometimes I wish we were more poll-driven, because the overwhelming majority of Australians think this is a good idea. The overwhelming number of economists think this is a good idea. I mean, we've had former head of the ACCC, Rod Sims, former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry. All of these people have come out and agreed with the Australia Institute, who's been saying it for quite some time, that this is a good idea. The public want it. The experts want it. But this is how powerful the fossil fuel industry is in Australia.
We're not asking the question, should everybody be throwing soup on paintings? What we're doing is getting the conversation going so we can ask the questions that matter. Questions like, is it okay that Liz Truss is licensing over 100 new fossil fuel licenses? Is it okay that fossil fuels are subsidised 30 times more than renewables when offshore wind is currently 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels? Is it okay that it is there in action that has led us to the cost of living crisis? Where this winter people are going to be forced to choose between heating and eating? This is the conversation we need to be having now.
Anything else you want to add about this that people should know?
Just that there's nothing standing between us and much better outcomes, whether it's more support for people that are struggling, more investment in decarbonisation, or if you wanted to, lower debt. Like, it doesn't matter what your political perspective is. This is good economics. It's good politics. It's good retail politics, but clearly the internal politics, the influence the oil and gas industry has over our major political parties means this is a fight that I want to pick. But it's a $40 billion opportunity.
Just sitting there.
Just literally sitting there. Just come and pick up the fruit off the ground.
Oh, and we've got a budget coming so close, Richard.
Oh, you never know. You never know.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thanks, Eb.
This episode was recorded live on Tuesday, the 18th of October, 2022, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including our windfall profits tax paper. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _T, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.